Um, do you have any general recommendations for people who are doing domestic travel but changing time
Yeah,
zones? Is the first question, and then the follow up from that: are there actually any impacts or effects due to even just changing time zones by just 3 hours,
yeah,
for
yeah,
example? I would imagine the magnitude of the impact or effect is going to be larger for a 16-hour
yeah.
kind of time zone change. But what does that look like, and what does that
So
impact look
jet
like?
lag is really interesting, and uh, you get over jet lag primarily as a result of exposure to light in the new time zone and eating on that time zone and being active in that new time zone. But on average, it takes a day for every time zone you've crossed to adapt. So if you're going from, let's say, London to Sydney, which is 12 hours, it'll take you up 10 to 12 days to fully adapt. Um,
Oh,
so
okay.
it's a big
Interesting.
chunk of time. There are ways in which you can increase that adaptation. So the rule of thumb, if you want to adapt, and we'll come back to this in a second, if you want to adapt, is that if you're traveling west, so when I come and visit you in New York from the UK,
Hmm.
I'm moving to a later time zone, as it were. I'm adapting to an expanding day, and that's much easier for most of
Hmm.
us. And so the rule of thumb
Yep.
is you get out when you get to New York. And you can't hardly help stop yourself. Get out there, experience the Big Apple, get your photon shower, and that will allow you to adapt to the new environment. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated because dusk light delays the clock, makes you get up later, go to bed later, whereas morning
Okay.
light advances the clock, makes you go to bed earlier and get up earlier. Now, naturally, 90% of people have a slightly longer body clock. So they're drifting later and later and later. So that's why it's easier to fly from London to New York because you're drifting in
Yep.
the right direction. And when it's sort of a dusk in the UK is when you're getting light in New York, and so you're going to adapt much more. You're going to delay the clock and you're going to adapt faster to New York time. So, rule of thumb, if you're traveling west, get out there, get light exposure, and you'll adapt faster. The problem is if you're traveling east. So, let's use the example that I'm familiar with, which is going from the UK to Australia. Now,
Yep.
when it's arriving in Australia at their morning will be
Hmm.
our evening, which means that you hit the clock during the delay portion. You're actually hitting the clock when it thinks it's evening, and that will push it back towards Europe.
Okay.
So the key thing is to avoid morning light for the first 3 or 4 days when you arrive after a big eastward shift, and that means just
Hmm.
using sunglasses and stuff like that, and then
Okay.
actively seek out afternoon light because that will be your morning, which will advance the clock and shift it and drag it forward to Australia time. So 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 that's the rule of thumb. And there are apps you can download which you can plug in where you are, where you're going, and when you need to see light. But they're all based upon the same principle, which is dusk light delays, morning light advances. So
Okay.
that's if you want to adapt. I think it becomes particularly difficult for the business sector, um,
Yeah.
because they'll fly. Let's just say they'll arrive, they'll possibly go straight into a meeting, or there'll be a meeting the next day, and then they'll leave again. And so there's no point in making any real effort to adapt. What you've got to do
Yeah.
is then override all of um, the effects of being out of kilter. So as we touched on in the
Hmm.
talk, you're going to have more irritability, greater anxiety, loss of empathy, more impulsivity, all that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
lack of cognition, the failure to multitask. So you've got to be aware that if you do a big time jump, your ability to process information will be impaired. So take longer
Yep.
to think about decisions and make those decisions. And if you can, get somebody else that you can talk it through with, because you will not be at
Mhm.
your peak cognitive performance. So that's the first thing. Be aware. And this is really interesting, because the tired brain is so tired it can't detect how tired it is, which means that, oh yeah, I'm
Yep.
fine. Well, actually, you're not. It's the brain is brilliant at defooling itself. Just be aware. You can't do it. There's a lovely study on UK cab drivers, taxi drivers, and they were asked,
Hmm.
how do you find the night shift? Oh, it's no problem. It's fine. Then they were brought into the lab and they were tested. Their cognition was tested, and you'd never get into a cab at night again. I mean, and
Yeah.
so just be aware you will be impaired. So what else can you do? Well, I think make sure that the environment that you're working in is as bright as possible, lots and lots of light, because bright light increases levels of alertness and therefore is going to override some of that impairment. And the other thing, which is very useful, and it's the old technique that everybody knows about, which is drinking coffee, because what coffee does
Hmm.
is block those adenosine receptors within the brain, and of course
Hmm.
it's that which is telling the brain it's tired, that buildup of adenosine the longer you've been awake. So just sort of be aware that a cup of coffee will help. Be careful though, because when the coffee wears off, you can go into a massive sort of nosedive in terms of your your
Right.
your your cognition. The other thing I would strongly urge is that you don't, if you're tired, don't immediately jump into a car and drive somewhere. I think it's really
Mm.
important. If you possibly can, if you've got the time, well, then you stay over, you rest up a bit for a night, drive the next day, or if you've got to get straight there, use public transport or get a cab or something. I know it's expensive, but it's better than the alternative. So so for the
Hmm.
business, and it's tricky. I mean, basically, you've got to find ways that will override that impairment. So it's being aware you're not going to be able to think right. So get help. Use bright light to increase alertness, and use caffeine to try and block the brain's perception of tiredness.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. One of the things, this is very anecdotal and not from research at all, but for me personally, getting into my exercise routine wherever the new location
Yes,
is there any evidence
there
that
is.
supports exercising?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Dale, that's a good point. I've forgotten to mention that. So you can adapt faster by exercising at the same time every day. Usually morning with that light. If you're, which can be very useful after you've arrived. You've got a few days, and I've said avoid morning light. So exercise, but not under light to begin with, and then later on combine the exercise with light, and that will speed up the transition. So what's your
Okay.
regime when you travel to Australia?
So I just try and keep up with my regular exercise
Yeah.
routine. So I'm pretty good nowadays, just with getting onto the right time. Um, I noticed that my children don't. But the challenge is, I have my routine and I have the way that I do things, but they're not likely to come
No.
out and go for a
No.
run or go to the gym with me.
Some
So,
very interesting data, and I don't know if this is the case in your family, is that women adapt faster to jet lag than men, and that's true
mhm,
for humans and mice. And what's fascinating is
mhm.
that in the master clock in the suprachiasmatic nuclei, there are estrogen receptors. And they're in a part of the SCN, which is part of the output pathway. So we've got some unpublished data, and we think that actually estrogen is modulating the signals from the clock to the rest of the body. And in this case, it's speeding things up, speeding up adaptation. And of course, the nature of jet lag We
Interesting.
published a paper in Cell a few years ago showing that, the basis. We know what the molecule is. So there's there's
Hmm.
the light input pathway, and you start to change the hands of the clock by changing gene expression, and then it stops. So we were puzzled with, why doesn't it continue? Why don't you just completely realign to the new light dark cycle? Why does it have to be incrementally? And it's because
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
a protein called SYK1, salt inducible kinase 1. And what that does is it phosphorylates, it adds a phosphate group to part of that pathway, and it turns the whole thing
Hmm.
off. So we're up jet lag. And in fact, we've taken that protein away in mice. And we've shifted the light dark cycle as if we were flying them, to Perth, from Oxford to Perth, and they adapt within a day, not 8 days. It's really fascinating. So,
Hmm.
so we understand the molecular basis of it. I remember having the privilege of meeting, as he was then, Prince William. Um, and he'd obviously been
Hmm.
well briefed, because he said to me, "So what do I do? What do I do about jet lag?" So I said, "So well, the good news is that we understand the molecular basis of jet lag, and we can cure it in a mouse. We can't yet do that in a human." So he sort of roared with laughter. Yeah, we've got to we know what to do. We know what the target is, but we haven't developed the drug yet.
That's interesting. So it's a post-translational
Yes.
modification. So it's
Well,
a
yeah,
phosphorylation. Is there like a transcriptional component
yeah.
somewhere
So,
in the pipeline
that's
pathway,
quite
or?
right. So what you've got is a Cre domain, and in many of these
Mhm.
genes which are activated. So you have CREB and CRTC1, and to get that
Mhm.
CREB. The CREB has to be phosphorylated, but the CRTC1 has to be
Mhm.
dephosphorylated. And in that
Okay.
state, they can then act as a transcriptional regulator and drive gene expression. And what happens is that there is a Cre domain in SYK1 in the gene. And so it will be
Mhm.
activated in the same way that the light input pathway activates the clock genes, with a slight delay. But what it does is it phosphorylates CRTC1. And in the phosphorylated state,
Okay.
it can't bind to CREB. So the whole complex breaks up, and the
Mhm.
transcriptional regulation breaks down. Yeah, it's so cool. It's just
Interesting.
wonderful to
That is
explain.
cool.
It's
So,
wonderful to, when you're feeling really rotten. You can think about that SYK1 as the molecule, and it's also worth bearing in mind. It
yeah.
goes back to some of the other stuff we discussed, which is that why you feel so awful when you've shifted across 4 or 5 or 6 time zones, and it's not because the whole clock
Yeah.
has shifted, the whole circadian system has shifted 5 hours. It's because some bits have shifted and other bits haven't. So it's that analogy I think I use of an orchestra. So all the bits of the orchestra are playing at a slightly different time. So you've got this cacophony rather than a beautiful symphony, and that's what's happening to the
Mhm.
multiplicity of clock cells throughout the body. They're all now sort of slightly misaligned, and so you just feel ghastly.
A participant in the seminar asked, or the webinar, sorry, asked what your thoughts are on some of the apps that help combat jet lag. Are you familiar with any of these apps, and
Yes.
do they
Well,
work?
well, well
Or?
yeah. So basically, they're straightforward. They've built in. It's a simple model of how the circadian system responds to light, and we go back to delays. Dusk delays the clock. Morning light advances the clock, and so you plug in where you are coming from, and and how best to expose yourself to light in the new time zone to achieve entrainment and a realignment. And it's very straightforward, and they work well. I mean, you can calculate it for yourself, but it's easier with an app, particularly if you're tired.
Mhm.
So yes, so I think there are a number out there, and they all work on the same principle, as far as I'm aware. So yes, I think it's something that could be very useful.